Okay, almost done with material. Unit 9.3, Part 2, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, 1945 to 1964. So returning back to Russia, the USSR, after we've just talked about the Korean War, Soviet successfully testing the atomic bomb. We talked a little bit about China, kind of just setting up the world stage there with the Berlin Crisis and all of these things, NATO going on after World War II. And so now let's return to Russia under Stalin. Stalin will, after the war, reinstitute oppressive rule. Remember, he kind of lightened up during the war in order to get the people of the country on board. It had been the Great Patriotic War of the Fatherland, and had fostered Russian nationalism and a relaxation of dictatorial power. But right as this ends, he goes right back to that repressive nature or oppressive nature. So Stalin actually gets meaner as he gets older, rather than kind of loosening up. He is going to struggle with a new foe, us, the United States, and it provides him with the perfect excuse for reestablishing a harsh dictatorship. That he has these outside threats is the way he's going to present it, that is going to require him to do so. After the war, Stalin is going to repress millions of Soviet citizens living outside Soviet borders when the war ended. And between 1946 to 1953, the Soviet government was responsible for over 12 million deaths of its own citizens, more than any other period during the 20th century, even the Civil War and the purges. Most of the deaths occurred in the gulags, which we talked about, those forced labor camps. We'll talk about them a couple times as we finish out the Cold War. We'll also see 5-year plans in the USSR reintroduced to tackle massive economic reconstruction. We kind of left those behind prior to World War II. And then Stalin is going to revive many forced labor camps, which have accounted for roughly 1/6 of all new construction in the Soviet Union before the war. Culture and art will also be purged again. Anything against communism is going to be gotten rid of, as well as the people that are behind that art or culture. Countries in Eastern Europe where troops have been left after World War II will be dominated by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is going to stay in Eastern Europe, and anything behind the Iron Curtain will be controlled by the Soviet Union. This included Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. Communist parties of Eastern Europe are going to establish one party state. So we're going back to, that no competition in the party system. With the help of the Red Army and the KGB, or the Soviet Secret Police. Here's where we get, though, to letter A. Circle this, write the exception, because AP Euro loves exceptions. Only Yugoslavia, led by Marshal Josip Broz Tito, ruled from 1944 to 1980, was not dominated by Soviets. This is the exception. Yugoslavia had freed itself from Nazi domination without the help of the USSR, therefore troops did not remain there to control them. And they will have a mixed economy with private ownership of certain businesses, state control of basic industries, and collectivization of farming. Over 500,000 Czechs who were seen as the threat to the communist state were purged at the behest of Stalin, and this is a little bit due to this independent streak. As USSR imposes its rule, 200,000 will be arrested in Hungary, 180,000 in Romania, and 80,000 in Albania. So you can see like Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Albania going to be controlled by the USSR. Our exception here, Yugoslavia. An uprising in East Germany in 1953 will also be crushed by Soviet troops. So all of these places dominated by the Soviet Union except Yugoslavia. Keep that exception in mind. As far as post-war economic recovery went in Eastern Europe, it would proceed along Soviet lines. Remember, Western Europe, the Marshall Plan, had helped build back Europe, but it had been blocked in the East by Stalin. You could very easily do a compare and contrast in an FRQ of Western economic recovery and Eastern economic recovery, the similarities, the differences. The changes in Eastern Europe went forward at a slow and uneven pace, whereas in Western Europe, we had seen that picture before, and then the massive changes after. Most are going to have 5-year plans like in the USSR rather than the Marshall Plan in Western Europe. Emphasized heavy industry and agriculture rather than consumer goods, also different than Western Europe where consumer goods were made. Czechoslovakia, however, you can write the exception next to here. Try to keep those my letter A's. Czechoslovakia is the exception when it comes to post-war economic recovery because it had been created after World War I. It had a democracy during its development. And so it will be well industrialized, strong middle class, industrial working class, experience with political democracy between the wars. During the dualist period, President Benes and Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk will propose to govern a social democracy while maintaining close voluntary relations with the USSR. So not really full communism, but a social democracy. In response to the Marshall Plan in 1947, Stalin will replace the government in 1948 with a one-party communist rule to prevent the nation from courting the West, but economically the exception. So here's where we're going to see a transfer of power. Stalin is going to have a stroke in the middle of the night. He will be found the following evening. I guess if Stalin is saying he's sleeping in by not coming down to breakfast or lunch, you wouldn't go up to wake Stalin. And then when they do find him, they take their time seeking help. As you can imagine, cranky Stalin in his old age wasn't very well liked. There is some question to whether he something devious didn't happen to him, but from what we can tell, a stroke, no matter like what it was caused by. But he will die a couple weeks later after being found, and we will see a power struggle ensue after he dies, as there's no successor left. An individual by the name of Nikita Khrushchev will come forward, and he will call the rule that Stalin had a cult of personality, a term that he created to describe Stalin's rule, that it's kind of like getting praise for no real reason or not earning that praise that one is given. But Khrushchev will emerge as the leader after a few years of this struggle, and Stalin's successors, including Khrushchev, will realize that reforms were needed, that they needed to calm stuff down, that the Stalinization had gone too far. Widespread fear and hatred of Stalin's political terror resulted in reduction of power of secret police, gradual closure of the gulags. Agriculture was in really bad shape. They needed to address that. Things were booming in the 1950s in the United States, and of course pictures of consumer goods will get into the USSR, making the people, feel resentful or unhappy for the lack of things that they had there. Hard work and initiative declined due to poor living conditions, and so a de-Stalinization program will take place under Khrushchev. At the 20th Party Congress in 1956, he'll take a startling initiative against hardliners being the supporters of Stalin, by denouncing Stalin's crimes in a closed session. It's kind of a secret anti-Stalin speech. Pretty much calls Stalin a loser. And this is probably the most influential statement in Russia since Lenin's April Theses in 1917. And it's in this de-Stalinization that he will propose a plan called the Gaz Plan, in which he will shift resources from heavy industry and the military towards consumer goods to try to appease the people, and towards agriculture, so there's some food, and centralized economic planning. Khrushchev sought to prove that communism was superior to capitalism, while the USSR would be the model communist state in the world. He also begins to woo new nations of Asia and Africa with promises and aid, even if they were not communists. So he tries to start to build friends. And then there'll be the speech at the UN, at which Khrushchev will take off his shoe and hit the podium and state, "We will bury you." Thinking more economically, promising an eclipse economically of the United States and allies, but you can see how it could be taken out of context. But his plan is to try to show that communism and USSR are the model system. There'll be a great ferment in the arts, so we'll have culture and arts come back as anti-Stalinist views are tolerated. Boris Pasternak will give us Dr. Zhivago in this time period, a story of an intellectual who rejects the brutality of the Bolshevik Revolution and Stalinism. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which we talked about, gives One Day in the Life of Ivan Dezhnych, which was about the Gulag archipelagos, detail life in Stalinist Gulag. I think he finally eventually comes to the United States, where maybe he dies, because he will be, and with another leader we're going to talk about in a second, then exiled. And I do think stays here till his death, but come back to that. De-Stalinization resulted in communist reformers and the masses seeking greater liberty and national independence. So with giving some a little bit of freedom, we're going to start to see that other places start to want more. You give an inch, they want to take a mile. Khrushchev was willing to allow different forms of socialism to occur in various Eastern European countries as long as the Communist Party remained in control. But in Poland of March 1956, riots resulted in a release of more than 9,000 political prisoners, including previously purged leader Wisław Gomulka. We'll have the Hungarian uprising in 1956. Students and workers will see a lot of these uprisings are by very young individuals. In Budapest, installed a liberal communist reformer, Imre Nagy, as new chief in October of 1956. This is kind of like the Arab Spring, if you had to compare it to something. Hungarian nationalists will stage huge demonstrations demanding non-communist parties be legalized. It will turn into an armed rebellion and spread throughout the country. They really hoped, the Hungarians, that the United States would come in and help achieve Hungarian independence because they are standing up against the communists. But I think we look at it as in, you're kind of behind Iron Curtain, and that we never come in. Soviet tanks and troops will respond to this Hungarian uprising by invading Hungary and crushing the National Democratic Revolution. Zseno Kabar will install firm communist rule after that point. And due to this, most Eastern Europeans will hope for some small domestic gains while obediently following the USSR in foreign affairs. And so it kind of shuts down this idea of rebellion, but also like we want some of this de-Stalinization to come to us without consequence. So also during Khrushchev's rule, as a whole, relations between the USSR and the United States are going to improve in the 1950s with the rise of power of Nikita Khrushchev, because Khrushchev is going to seek peaceful coexistence with the West. This will allow him to focus on improving the Soviet economy. So although he wants to bury us economically, he realizes he can't keep the Cold War semi-hot and counter and improve the economy of his country. In the Austrian independence, the USSR is going to agree in 1955 to real independence for a neutral Austria after 10 years of Allied occupation. So this is going to relieve a significant amount of tension in the Cold War between 1955 and 1957. We'll see the Geneva Summit in 1955. The USSR will meet with the United States, Britain, and France to begin discussions on European security and disarmament. No agreements will result, but at least there's a meeting. But then in 1957, something is going to happen called the Sputnik crisis. A Russian satellite will be sent into orbit on a rocket and was brought back safely to the USSR. It was called Sputnik. Scientifically, this was an unprecedented achievement and one that the USSR reached before us. And it effectively begins the space race with the United States, as Americans were horrified that the Soviets had eclipsed the United States technology in this area. Remember, we kind of always had the head start on anything. We will start to spend massive amounts of money on education, in math and science especially, because we're afraid that we're falling behind. And in 1958, USSR's relations with the United States will sour even further with Khrushchev's ultimatum for allies to leave Berlin. I think he gets a little high off the Sputnik thing and then starts making demands. Although his 6-month deadline will pass without incident and was extended indefinitely, this will sour relations, and then the Cold War will worsen during the early 1960s because of the U-2 spy plane incident. So we have been flying U-2 spy planes over Russia before 1960, but up until that point, they couldn't be shot down until 1960 when an anti-aircraft will take down a U-2 spy plane. The pilot will be able to eject. His name is Gary Powers. And there was a self-destruct button, but he is unable to hit it before ejecting from the plane. So we think the plane's been destroyed, but it hasn't. Khrushchev and the Russians are going to, we have this plane, we know what you were doing. We don't know that they have the plane or the camera or the film. So we say, oh, it's just like surveying, agriculture, etc. So we're kind of caught red-handed by the Reds. Um, Khrushchev will demand an apology from President Eisenhower. Eisenhower will refuse. Um, the scheduled Paris summit in 1960 that was going to follow up to the Geneva summit will be canceled as a result of this. Gary Powers will be tried and found guilty, but released in 1962 in a spy swap. He will then later become a helicopter news reporter and actually die in a helicopter crash. So survives one crash, has another, but that's just a side note. Then we have the Berlin Wall. 2 million East Germans have been able to escape West Berlin, so we're going to just watch tension steadily rise here. The Soviets and East German government will grow increasingly frustrated, and in 1961, Khrushchev will threaten to enforce his 1958 ultimatum, which he never did, the 6 months to remove, and declared the USSR would sign peace treaty with East Germany, who would then control access to Berlin. The Soviets would protect East Germany's right to control flow into Berlin. The United States, Britain, and France, of course, are going to refuse to leave, and East Germany will build then. As a result, instead of enforcing the ultimatum to the United States, build the Berlin Wall around West Berlin, effectively ending the future crises over Berlin, and to kind of just try to put a stop to all of this tension. The wall is to keep East Berliners from leaving, not to keep West Berliners in. So kind of a different purpose than you think of, most walls are meant to keep people out rather than, keeping people in. But it was to keep the East Berliners in. There are 3 checkpoints that are armed that you can pass through. People will try to tunnel and do all kinds of stuff, and it will come down in 1989. And we'll talk about it as we end on Unit 9.4. But it is going to end the crisis over Berlin for this point. But another crisis is brewing. Another point of tension, I should say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, October of 1962. So, during this time, 1962, Cuba will become 90 miles away from the United States, will become a communist country in 1959 under the leadership of Fidel Castro and a staunch ally of the USSR. So here we are in the United States with a containment policy. This institutes a huge containment failure. 90 miles away, we have a country that becomes communist and very close friends with the USSR. So, our president Eisenhower is going to formulate a plan or a secret overthrow with our support to really just aid a coup in Cuba, but without trying to make it look like we're aiding. It's going to be called the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. U.S.-trained Cuban exiles will try unsuccessfully to invade Cuba. It's during this time that a very young JFK comes in and into the presidency, and not wanting to look like he doesn't support our attempts to keep Cuba from being communist, goes ahead with it. In response to this unsuccessful invasion of Cuba, Cuba will agree to place Soviet nuclear missiles on its land to protect against a future U.S. invasion. So now we have nuclear-grade weapons 90 miles from the United States, and this sparks the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The U.S. will demand Soviets remove their newly installed nuclear missiles from Cuba, and this crisis will become the closest that the USSR and the United States came to a nuclear war during the Cold War. They are going to play chicken here, as we'll place a U.S. naval blockade, and Khrushchev and the United States will be charging each other. Khrushchev is going to move away and agree to remove the missiles in return for the United States removing its missiles from Turkey and vowing never to invade Cuba. This crisis, and Khrushchev kind of showing a little bit of weakness there with a very young JFK as president, will contribute to his downfall in 1964, but it will also contribute to a nuclear test ban treaty in 1963. There's been all of this nuclear testing going on, releasing radiation into the sky. The United States, USSR, and Britain, who've been testing, are going to sign a historic treaty banning atmospheric testing in an attempt to reduce Cold War tensions. Also, kind of protect the environment. Now all testing had to be done underground. France, however, is going to refuse to sign it because it was just in the process of developing its nuclear weapons program and felt behind. And China will become a nuclear power in 1964, leading to its estrangement with the Soviet Union, which we'll talk about later. But then back to Khrushchev. He will have a fall in power, and we're going to go over the reasons right now. First of all, his Cold War foreign policies were seen by the Politburo as erratic and ultimately unsuccessful. The Berlin and Cuban Missile Crisis, his demands in Berlin, he backed out of both. Expensive space and armament programs postponed any significant shift to consumer goods, which is what he kind of promised and what the country was looking for to be caught up with the rest of the world. But the most important reason is that his agricultural projects backfired and people didn't have anything to eat. So the resurgence of conservative Stalinists led to quiet removal of Khrushchev in October of 1964, and this is where we'll see Brezhnev become the new general secretary 1964 to 1982. And that we are going to see that his goals are going to be to build up the military regardless of cost, and ironically, although he focuses his attention on military buildup and wanting the USSR to be kind of at its height, it is also a very peaceful time in the Cold War. So the Soviet Union and Cold War under Brezhnev. So the Soviet Union and Cold War under Brezhnev, beginning in 1964, the USSR began a period of stagnation and limited re-Stalinization. Massive arms buildup started in response to the humiliation of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The USSR is going to avoid direct confrontation with the United States and ironically seemed more committed to peaceful coexistence than Khrushchev had even been. Re-Stalinization of the USSR resulted to a degree. Dictatorship was collective rather than personal through the Politburo again. Intense conservatism of Soviet ruling elite was determined to maintain the status quo in the Soviet bloc, and celebrated nonconformists such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, with the archipelago of gulags, were permanently expelled from the country. And then we'll have 1968 is kind of a global, like Vietnam, war protests and things in the United States, and then in Europe, 1968, kind of a key date. We're going to have the Prague Spring and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. So in 1968, the invasion of Czechoslovakia was the crucial event of the Brezhnev era. Probably the thing that's most remembered and you need to remember. Due to Khrushchev's reforms in the USSR, the 1960s brought the modest liberalization and more consumer goods to Eastern Europe. And in 1968, reform elements in the Czechoslovak Communist Party gained a majority and voted out a longtime Stalinist leader. Alexander Dubček was the new elected leader, ushered a new period of thaw and rebirth in the famous Prague Spring of 1968. This is kind of just like the 1956 Hungarian uprisings. He wanted to have socialism with a human face. He sought greater democracy and freedom of speech, like that social democracy that we had seen that they wanted. And the influence of Czech reformers frightened hardline communists, especially those that had been hardliners that wanted re-Stalinization. Soviet troops then will brutally invade Czechoslovakia in August of 1968 with the help of other Eastern Bloc countries, and Czechoslovakia will then become one of the most hardline communist regimes well into the 1980s. This is what underlies the Brezhnev Doctrine issued in response to the Prague Spring, that henceforth the Soviet Union and its allies had the right to intervene in any socialist country whenever they saw the need. And it's really his mirrored attempt or his mirror alignment to our Truman Doctrine, where we had stated that we would protect the democracy of any Western nation. And so, letting other Eastern Bloc countries know that we will step in and protect communism if it is threatened. Us being the USSR, speaking in those terms. So that brings us to the Ostpolitik in West Berlin and Brezhnev's decisions there. So Ostpolitik just means Eastern politics. Willy Brandt will become the West German Chancellor in 1969 to 1974, and he's going to try to begin to improve relations with Eastern Europe through his Eastern Initiative. He's going to seek a comprehensive peace settlement for Central Europe and a new resolution of the German question, or what do we do with this two German states in one German nation. He is going to negotiate treaties with the USSR, Poland, and Czechoslovakia that formally accepted existing state boundaries and the loss of German territory to Poland and the USSR in return for mutual renunciation of force or threat of force. He gives us that quote, two German states in one German nation, that we're all German. We just happen to be divided into two states now, and his government is going to break with the past and enter into direct relations with East Germany. He's going to aim for modest practical improvements rather than reunification, and Brandt brought Germany's Social Democratic Party, they're the SPD, to national power for the first time since the 1920s, which is where we left them. He demonstrated that two-party political democracy had taken a firm hold, and the result of his policies are that West Germany's Eastern Peace Settlement contributed to the great reduction in East and West tensions, and Germany is going to assume a leadership role in Europe that it maintains to today. And this ushers in a time of detente, or relaxation, in our Cold War era. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and President Richard Nixon, who's now our United States President in this time period, are going to try to place Brandt's Eastern Initiative into a broader or larger American-led framework of reducing East and West tensions in the early 1970s, because they feared that Germany might become neutral, thus weakening NATO and the United States' influence in Europe. So Nixon is going to hope to gain Soviet aid in pressuring North Vietnam into agreeing to end the Vietnam War. Nixon is an example of a realpolitik in the 1970s. Nixon and Kissinger believed the United States should pursue policies and make alliances based on its national interests rather than on an ideological worldview. So communist, democratic, whatever, it needs to be alliances based on our interests. And they thought to play realpolitik style the USSR and China off each other. So while we wouldn't have wanted to friend any communist nation in an ideal sense, Nixon's going to say whatever we have to do to pursue our higher national calling, we will do. So Nixon is going to visit China in 1972. Which will do exactly what he wanted and make Soviets concerned that China and the United States might draw even closer. And then he will visit Moscow in 1972, ushering in an era known as the détente, or this relaxation, which sought to establish rules to govern the rivalry between the United States, the USSR, and China. As a result, in 1972, SALT I will be signed, and Brezhnev and Nixon will agree to stop making nuclear ballistic missiles and to reduce the number of anti-ballistic missiles to 200 for each power. Yet, development of MIRVs soon thereafter made SALT I obsolete. Those are multiple warheads on one missile, but it is a kind of a benchmark in this time of detente that an agreement can be made in this armament race. Then the Helsinki Conference in Finland will take place in 1975. And this is where the final act document will be signed, which will officially, finally, in 1975, end World War II by legitimizing the Soviet-dictated boundaries of Poland and other eastern countries. In return, Soviets are going to guarantee more liberal exchanges of people and information between the East and West, and the protection of certain basic human rights, although they will continue to march all over these human rights, torture, censorship, etc. And we will see, however, the end of this detente or relaxation period with a new president, President Carter, in 1979, who is much less a realpolitik and much more idealistic. But really what ends this detente is going to be the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This is going to lead to United States our refusal to ratify SALT II, a treaty that was going to reduce nuclear armaments and led to President Carter's boycott of the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. So he boycotts those Olympics. Then the Soviets, in response, will boycott the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles, so we refuse to participate in each other's Olympics. The United States will stop shipments of grain and certain advanced technology to the Soviet Union, and this is where we find that only Britain will stand behind us, behind our sanctions, due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, because France, Italy, and especially West Germany argued that the Soviets' deplorable action should not be turned into an East-West confrontation. And so this is where that special friendship between ourselves and Britain will continue and be maintained there. And so then let's turn our attention back to Eastern Europe again before we finish this Section 2 video. So the Solidarity movement is going to take place in Poland because Poland has maintained it is mostly Catholic, and Pope John Paul II, a Polish cardinal, will be elected as Pope in 1979, and he will then travel through Poland preaching love of Christ and country and what he restates from the Enlightenment, inalienable rights of men, some very Locke-esque things there, which wouldn't have been supported by communism, your inalienable rights. And it is going to inspire a popular movement of working people who organized a massive union called Solidarity. It's led by Lech Walesa, and the demands included the right to form free trade unions, the right to strike, freedom of speech, release of political prisoners, and economic reforms. And in 1981, the Polish government, led by Communist Party leader General Jerzy Kalecki, imposed martial law after being warned by Soviets if the Polish government could not keep order, the Soviets would. And Solidarity will be outlawed and driven underground, but remain active, and we'll come back to that as we finish up this weekend. So that just brings us with the 1980s to 1990s left with nationalism, which I have stopped the video for so that you can watch in 30-minute segments, and that will finish Unit 9.3, and then just a very short run through of the dryness of economics, which have kind of played out here, but just solely economics as a unit, and then that is it for content. Checkpoint quiz opens on Monday and closes on Friday, and then video showings to John on Monday, as well as your defense of the Cold War brackets due by then as well.